Alright, I was kind of hanging around today. Wife and kids are off doing some Girl Scout type stuff, so I thought I'd hang out with my buddy over there and do another little vid. I thought I'd talk about pistons. Yay, it's a piston. And see where that takes us. I got to do a little bit of setup, and I'm going to be doing, if my cat can get out of the way. There's my picture. There it is. I'm going to use this for some of it. Hopefully the editing is a little bit better than the last one. I had problems with batteries and memory card capacity. Sorry about that. And before I get going, if there's anything that, like, if you work your way through this and you just go, it was too confusing, let me know. If it was too long, let me know. Too short, not detailed enough. It's hard to believe it might not be detailed enough. But all right, before I get into the project mileage motor that CB Performance did, I wanted to take a look in the McCarthy book and see what McCarthy was doing. And basically there's not a whole lot going on in here until we get over to this point where he starts talking about the piston and cylinder assembly. And one of the things you get when you run one of these stroker cranks, I'm sure that pretty much everybody who watches this knows, is that your pistons are going to go farther out. So if you just bolt on a set of cylinders, your piston is going to stick out the top of your cylinder and smack the head. It doesn't bolt together very well. Given that this is a 76 and these cylinders are designed for 69 millimeters, you're going to stick out about 3.5 millimeters. That's not actually the case because of deck height, but you're going to be about 3.5 millimeters too far out. It'll pop out the top of the cylinder by about 2 millimeters. So you've got to be able to take care of that. There's a couple of ways you can do it, and the way that McCarthy has done it, if you can see in that picture, is he's got rings. In particular, he says down here, I used the 76 crank, we've already done that, and I used 3.5 millimeters of spacer. And he did it with 3 rings, and you can see them in the photo. So that's what he did. Now, what I did, like the CB guys, I have, if you can see them here in the picture, cylinder, 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 and his are 85.5. All right, I've got, here's an 85.5 piston. I don't actually have my 85.5 cylinders up here, but I do have, I had a free-floating piston, so I brought it up. But I have my 76 millimeter, sorry, I've got my 77 millimeter pistons and cylinder sets. These are the ones that I was running. These things have got about 60,000 miles on them. So what that means is that you put your crank in and your piston is going to pop out the top, something like that. So you put your spacers in, your cylinder goes out, your piston comes up to about right there. You got a little deck height, you bolt it together. But that's not the only way that you can do it. If we take a closer look at what I've got here on my 77 millimeter piston, and there's reasons why you do this. If you stick that much space, your motor is going to be fatter. And when you go to plug it into a Karmann Ghia, it works. And Karsi was built working with a Karmann Ghia, but I'm working on a Beetle. And if you're watching this, you're probably working on like a 73 or 73 Super Beetle, just like I am. And that extra width on your motor is not going to be happy inside your engine compartment. So you need to make it narrower. How do you go about making it narrower? And that's where you come over here and you take a look at my piston. It looks like a pretty ordinary piston. Well, let's see if I can line it up here with this 85.5. And right there you see a pretty significant difference. So in order for me to get done what I wanted to do, I took my pistons to the machine shop and I had them take 2 millimeters right off the top. Just cut them. And you're like, well, that's going to weaken them. Sure it does, but it's a mileage motor. It's not very stressed. And like I say, I've got 60, maybe 70,000 miles on these. As a matter of fact, you can see kind of the squish areas. The areas where there isn't that much carbon buildup, those are the squish areas. But these things ran fantastic. They ran cool. The motor didn't ping. It worked fantastic. And there's no cracks. They never cracked. So these pistons they're just overbuilt. It's an old design. They didn't have the kind of design analysis tools that they have these days when these were designed, so they just overbuilt them. So I was able to take a little bit off the top. Alright, so if I took a little bit off the top, that allowed me to get rid of some of my spacers. I also tapped into the squish, which is typically about 1.5 millimeters. I took that down to about 1 millimeter with these guys, which bought me another 0.5 millimeter. So I think that what I was running ultimately was, I don't know, in the vicinity of like a 1 millimeter spacer. So my motor, rather than being 7 millimeters wide, was only about 2 millimeters wide. And it fit in there. It fit in there okay. About the only other thing I could say is, like, if you really want to do a 1415cc, you're not going to be able to keep up with traffic. You could put a better camshaft than Carsey's Miler camshaft, like that cheater cam they do over there in the Miler motor. But you're still going to be down on horsepower. It's still going to be really hard to keep up with traffic. It's just it's too small a motor for living in the real world these days. Whatever. Anyway, I need to move into the selection of the 85.5 millimeter piston, which you think is just, hey, that's a real easy thing to do, but it's not necessarily an easy choice. So you look at what these CB guys did, and they've got them sitting right there. Let's go down to the next page on this thing. And over here we've got the spacers that they selected. They've got some pretty fat spacers in there, but they're only doing singletons. Where's their actual piston? They're actually mounting their pistons right here. I think that's deck height checking. Popping the wrist pins in, getting circlips in, etc., etc. They've already done the balancing. There was balancing back here. Let me see what they did as far as balancing goes. Alright, they're weighing. Here's balancing. They actually drilled some meat out of the back of them. And if you read this article, they're doing something, let's go back over to this part right here, they're doing something called a B piston. Oh boy, I don't know if I can actually show it. Alright, but this is my 85.5, and they're doing a B 85.5. So this would be like an A piston, and this is a B piston. Now, back when I was doing these things back in the 1980s, they did not make 85.5 B pistons. They made B pistons in 90.5 and larger, but you know, these days they got them for this size, so they went ahead and they did it. But it's not just that they ran with a B piston; they also went with a what do you call it, a forged piston. And we'll get into that in just a second. But by going with a B piston, what that does, let's come back down to this guy right here. Let's pretend that this is an 85.5 of the B piston. Alright, the B piston is designed to work with an 82 millimeter stroke. So if you stick a 76 millimeter stroke on it, that means your piston is not going to come up into a proper deck height situation. It comes up to about, you know, something like that, and you got this massive deck height, and that's not going to work very well. It's bad for compression, combustion, you name it. So what they did was they got to, let's go back over here to their parts list again, if I can get there. And where are they? Alright, up here in their parts list, if you look right there, and there's two more of them right there. They went with H-beam rods. Those are longer length rods. So if you come back down here to the piston, you stick a longer rod in there, and it comes out like this. Those rods are so long that their piston, I think, actually came up pretty close to zero deck. So then they had to go and stick about 1.5 millimeters of spacers in. We'll get back to this guy right here. So they've got B pistons. They've balanced them. They're forged, and that gets you into a difference that I chose at this point. And like I say, I was actually going to run my 85.5, you know, these guys from my 1974. You know, I was going to pick up some new cylinders and run these guys right here. And you're like, why would you run these guys right here? Because they got a dish, they've got a little hole in them right there. And the neat thing about that hole, let me flip this thing over here. All right, we got to get some light on it. Can you see those ridges in the back there? Yeah, I think you can. They have a lot of additional reinforcing in the back. And because I don't like running spacers, I was going to do to these exactly what I did to my 77s. I was going to trim 2 millimeters right off the top. And since that dish right there is about 3 millimeters deep, you know that there's a bulk, a just ton of aluminum up in the top of this thing. So this kind of a piston will definitely survive having some material machined off the top of it. But I ultimately did not destroy my 1974 pistons. And the reason for not doing that comes into the reason that I would not have gone with a forged piston. As these days, you get a piston that is cast, and it's made of something called a hypereutectic alloy. And it's just a fancy word for saying that your piston has a higher silicon content in it relative to something like these. So what does that get you? It gets you some different metallurgical properties. And I wanted to take advantage of some of those properties. You'd think those properties wouldn't necessarily net you any mileage, but they have the potential to give you some mileage. Number one, it gives you a reduced thermal coefficient of expansion. So as the piston gets hotter, it's not going to bind up inside your cylinder. It's going to continue to operate because it's got less thermal variability. It also fits tighter in there from ground zero. And the byproduct of that is, in addition to that, we've got a very long piston relative to those B pistons. If you've got a tight fit, the piston doesn't rock. It doesn't bounce up and down. If I could get this thing to rock a little tiny bit. Hard to get it to rock. But it does very slightly bounce around inside its bore. So a newer piston that is cast with the hypereutectic alloy is going to fit in there a little bit tighter, and it's not going to rock as much. That's a nice property. It's something that you can use, and I think it's important to have that for mileage motor. The other property of the hypereutectic alloy is that it doesn't flow heat as well. So when it gets hot, it stays hot. You know, one of these coatings that people like to put on the tops of their cylinders is like a ceramic coating. So you put a ceramic coating on here so that you don't flow heat. Well, a good way of not flowing heat. I would never do a ceramic coating inside a motor like this. But another way of doing that would be, you know, this guy right here, out of hypereutectic, with the top shaved off of it a little bit. What you get then is a piston that's going to get hot. And one of the ways you make mileage is by retaining heat. And the neat thing about this is, if you go back to look at the inside of it, it's thick in the middle. Hard to do this, hard to show this. Let me see if I can get this to work right. And get a push rod out, maybe we can point at something. So if you look down, look down right in there. This little pit right here, this is fairly shallow at that point. It's very thick in the middle. And when you shave them out, the fact that it's very thin in that point, it matches with kind of an area around right here. So when you get to the point that your heat is attempting to dissipate out into the spread of the piston, the heat has a tendency to build up in the middle and not pass through. I mean, it takes a certain amount of material to allow it to pass through, and if you've reduced the amount of material for the heat to pass through, it builds up. So you get a buildup of heat at the very center of your piston, which is at the very center of your combustion chamber, and that's actually a pretty good thing. And like I say, it goes, you don't want, if I can get this thing back down here, these forged pistons, being higher in aluminum content, they're going to flow heat a lot better than this, the hypereutectics, and I think you actually need to retain heat. So that's another difference that I've picked. You've also got the issue of, that's a B piston. It's got short skirts, it's going to rock more. If you're rocking more, then you can't go tight on your deck height. So like my deck height is 030 and theirs is 055. So I went with a different piston. My pistons were actually fairly expensive. There's something called bus pistons. You can't buy them for the Beetles. You have to go and look for a bus piston. Okay, I'm not sure exactly where I left off, but yeah, my buddy's trying to help out again. I think I was talking about these 85.5s right here with the dish, and they make a fantastic foundation if you want to go the route of machining them down. I forget what they cost. I think it was about $20 each. Now you can go over to aircool.net and they have at least that piston and cylinder set listed. That doesn't mean he's got them in stock, but they are fairly expensive, $240. This is one of the things that you can't get from the AA piston guys. I don't think that those guys make a dished 85.5. So if you do go this route, one of the great things, like I said about it, is that I know I can take some material off the top of that piston. It's not going to blow up, and it's going to fit Now, dimensionally, once I put my spacers in, it's going to dimensionally fit in the car. There is one other thing that you need to consider. Let's see if I can zoom in real close. Alright, cylinders have a certain length to them. And the interesting thing about the Type 2, it says Type 2, and dish means it's low compression. It's not just that they're low compression because of that dish that would fit in the middle of that piston right there. The cylinders, you have to check your cylinders and make sure your cylinders are the right length. The ones that I got were actually longer. So they messed up some of my plans. I actually had to pause my build in order to get a right-sized spacer. Alright, so kind of in conclusion, if stop cat. If I was you and I was building a mileage motor, I would not go forged. I'd go cast. Don't go with the old ones. This material is obsolete these days. Go with the hypereutectic. I do like the idea of using a dish piston and machining it. It's going to cost you a few bucks to go that route, but I think it works. One of the things that I did not mention up to this point is that when you, let me get my other one back here. Alright, when you take that crown off like that, you get, actually they line up about like that, so that's about your difference right there. This does two things. One, it's going to make this piston lighter, and as far as vibration goes, vibration is energy being pissed away, so you don't, it's not a lot, but you can save yourself a little bit of energy by reduction of vibration, and you do that by reducing mass. So you take as much mass out of one of these pistons as you can. One of the best ways to do it is to just slice the top of the piston off. So that's another reason why I did it. There's also the issue of, let's go back to here, this one has a very, very little height between the top of the top ring and the top of the piston. And when you when you run your piston up like this and the fuel air mixture is getting compressed, everything pushes back toward the ring. And what gets back in this crack, just like what gets underneath your squish areas, like that squish area and that squish area, what gets under there doesn't burn. So by moving the top of your piston down closer to the top of your ring, you've got the advantage of lighter weight, less vibration, and more of your fuel becomes available for burning. In my particular car, if you watch my other videos, you know that I rebreathe all my crankcase fumes because I know that some unburned fuel is going to get past my rings, and I'm going to suck it up and put it back down in and burn it. So, all right, it's not complete. Let's take another thing that you need to be able to do. All right, a piston isn't just a piston, right? It's also got a connecting pin that goes in that guy right there. And if you get back to this guy right here, this is my 77. I've actually got one in there. What's nice about the 77s, that connecting pin is pretty small. And you go to the 85s and a halves, it's longer, it's heavier. The 85 and a half is just a bigger piston. It's going to weigh more, it's going to vibrate more. This little motor, it was pretty smooth. I got everything balanced, and just the lightness of everything. It was all the reciprocating mass, very light. It was pretty smooth. Not much power, but it was smooth. And anything you can do to take that wrist pin and lighten it up. I know that there are, CB Performance probably makes a lighter wrist pin. I don't know if they used it specifically in the CB build. Let me see. I don't think they did. I don't think they changed it over there in their build. But that is something that you would certainly want to think about, is dropping your mass by putting in a lighter weight pin. Something else you can do. When you balance these things, like I say, the CB guys, they did a B piston, so it didn't need to be clearanced. If you're doing an A piston, you've got to clearance them. You're going to have issues. Cast reviewed, you have to get out of the way, go away. You're going to have issues where the crank and the connecting rod come back, and they're going to dig out in this area. Your counterweights are going to whack at this point and this point. So you've got to clearance these guys for the counterweights. Your connecting rods are going to whack down over here and over here. And there's just a ton of extra metal in through here and in through here. So once you've clearanced it so that it clears, you go ahead and take a little bit more out. You just keep lightening this piston up. Just keep taking more and more mass out of here. Mill down, quite a bit by a Dremel, and it doesn't take too terribly long. And I did spend a fair amount of time Dremeling my 85.5s that I've got in my current build. And you know, like I said, once I got my clearancing done, I just kept going. I just kept sucking metal out of them. And you can take this little thing right here. It's got that little step in it right there. You just go all the way down. Just dig it all the way down, you know, including the step. Start digging that step out too. They're just overbuilt. So just keep lighting them. Make them balanced. Get them light. I don't think I got too much more on pistons. You know, like I said, in summary, do a hyper-eutectic piston. Do that before I would do a forged. I would do an 85.5. I would not bounce down to the 77. I used to live with the 77. I drove the 77 1415cc for years. I don't think you'll be able to keep up with traffic with that. You won't be happy with it. I think the 1745 can get pretty close to the same mileage, and you'll be a lot happier from a power standpoint. I don't know what else I can really say. I mean, if you want to run one of those B pistons and do a longer rod, the longer rod issue is not really piston related. So, I mean, that would be a different video, a different discussion about why you would want to do a longer versus a shorter rod. You know, I kind of, you know, these vids kind of ramble along a little bit. If they're too long, let me know. I mean, I can always do a little prep work on them rather than just sitting here and spewing. In general, I think I've only got about 4 or 5, maybe 6 people out of my 60-something subscribers, I guess is what you call them. And that's about 1 in 10. About only 1 in 10 of you are frequently watching this stuff. If you are a frequent watcher of my stuff, go ahead and put a comment down there. What do? They point at it, say, put a comment down there. And, you know, I have a choice of things that I can talk about. So since you're the people that are generally watching this stuff in a timely fashion, I may as well do it for you guys. Hope you enjoyed it. So long. Have a good day.